He was voted least likely to succeed by his own classmates at the Pasadena Playhouse. The instructors there didn't think he had what it took to make it as an actor. Gene Hackman went on to win 2 Academy Awards, star in some of the most acclaimed films of the 20th century, and build friendships with some of the biggest names in Hollywood history. In February 2025, Hackman was found dead at his home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, alongside his wife, Betsy Arakawa, at the age of 95. In the years leading up to his passing, in the interviews and reflections he gave throughout his long retirement, Hackman spoke often about the people who shaped his extraordinary career, the actors and collaborators who became not just co-stars, but some of the most important relationships of his life. This is the story of Gene Hackman and the 5 greatest stars he ever knew. Let's get into it. A hard start in San Bernardino. Eugene Allen Hackman was born on January 30, 1930, in San Bernardino, California, though he spent much of his childhood in Danville, Illinois. His early life was marked by instability. When Hackman was 13 years old, his father left the family, driving away from their home one afternoon without ever saying goodbye. Hackman later said watching his father's car disappear down the street was one of the defining moments of his childhood. At 16, Hackman lied about his age and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, serving for 4.5 years before being discharged. He drifted for years afterward, working odd jobs and briefly attending journalism school before deciding in his late 20s to pursue acting, a decision that struck almost everyone who knew him as unlikely for a man already approaching 30 with no formal training. The first star, Dustin Hoffman. In 1956, Hackman enrolled at the Pasadena Playhouse in California, where he met a fellow aspiring actor named Dustin Hoffman. The two, along with actor Robert Duvall, became close friends, sharing cramped apartments in New York City in the late 1950s while struggling to find acting work, often surviving on almost nothing. Here is where things get interesting. At the Pasadena Playhouse, Hackman and Hoffman were both voted by their classmates as the least likely among them to succeed in the industry. Decades later, both men would count multiple Academy Awards between them, a fact Hackman brought up more than once with visible amusement in later interviews. The friendship between Hackman and Hoffman lasted more than 6 decades, surviving the wild unpredictability of 2 acting careers and remaining, by all accounts, one of the most genuine relationships either man had in an industry not always known for lasting friendships. The second star, Warren Beatty. Hackman's breakthrough film role came in 1967, when he was cast as Buck Barrow, the brother of Clyde in Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde, starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway. The film was groundbreaking for its graphic violence and morally ambiguous portrayal of its outlaw leads, and it became one of the defining films of the New Hollywood movement. Hackman earned his first Academy Award nomination for the role, and the relationship he built with Betty, both as producer and co-star of the film, opened doors that had been closed to Hackman for over a decade of failed auditions and small television parts. Hackman later credited Betty's willingness to fight for him to be cast, over the studio's preference for a more established name, as one of the single most important breaks of his career. The third star, Roy Scheider. In 1971, Hackman starred as Popeye Doyle, a relentless, morally compromised New York City narcotics detective in The French Connection, alongside actor Roy Scheider. The film was shot with a gritty, documentary-style realism, unusual for major studio productions at the time, including a car chase sequence filmed partially without official permits on the streets of Brooklyn, a sequence still studied today as one of the most intense action sequences ever filmed. Now here is the wild card. Hackman has said in interviews that he initially found the character of Popeye Doyle difficult to connect with, viewing him as too unlikable to build a performance around until conversations with the real-life detective the character was based on, Eddie Egan, helped him understand the exhaustion and moral compromise underlying the character's aggression. His partnership with Scheider on screen, playing off each other's contrasting energy, became a key part of what made the film work. Hackman won his first Academy Award for Best Actor for the role. The fourth star, Clint Eastwood. In 1992, more than 2 decades after The French Connection, Hackman starred in Unforgiven, directed by and co-starring Clint Eastwood. Hackman played Little Bill Daggett, a corrupt, sadistic sheriff, a role that stood in sharp contrast to the noble Western lawman audiences had seen for decades. Hackman initially turned down the role, reportedly uncomfortable with the level of violence in the script and unwilling to be part of a film he felt glorified brutality. Eastwood personally convinced him that the film was, in fact, a subversion of the genre's usual glorification of violence, not a celebration of it. Hackman ultimately agreed, and his performance won him his second Academy Award, this time for Best Supporting Actor. Hackman later spoke about how much he respected Eastwood's discipline and restraint as a director, calling the experience one of the most professionally satisfying of his career. The fifth star, Gene Wilder. In 1974, in a very different register than his crime dramas, Hackman appeared in a small but memorable role in Mel Brooks's comedy Young Frankenstein, starring Gene Wilder. Hackman played a blind hermit in a scene widely regarded as one of the funniest sequences in American comedy film history, a stark departure from the intense, morally complicated characters that otherwise defined his filmography. Here is the thing that puts it all in perspective. Hackman took the uncredited role as a favor to Mel Brooks and out of admiration for Wilder's work, reportedly asking for the part after reading the script and laughing out loud, despite being, at that point, an established Academy Award-winning dramatic actor with little obvious reason to take a small comedic cameo. It became one of his most beloved performances among audiences who otherwise associated him almost exclusively with intensity and menace. And it showed a side of Hackman's range that his more famous dramatic roles rarely allowed him to display, a career built on character, not glamour. Unlike many of the leading men who rose to fame alongside him, Hackman never fit the traditional mold of a Hollywood movie star. He was often the first to point out with characteristic bluntness that he didn't have the classic good looks of contemporaries like Beatty or Robert Redford, and that he had built his entire career instead on an ability to disappear into difficult, morally complicated men. That willingness to play unlikable characters without softening them for audience approval became, over time, his defining trademark. It carried him through decades of work far beyond the films that earned him his 2 Academy Awards. He played the domineering, emotionally distant patriarch in Wes Anderson's The Royal Tenenbaums in 2001, a performance that introduced him to an entirely new generation of filmgoers decades into his career and earned him a Golden Globe for Best Actor. He played basketball coach Norman Dale in Hoosiers in 1986, a role frequently cited by athletes and coaches as one of the most authentic depictions of sports leadership ever put on film. He played the villainous Lex Luthor across multiple Superman films in the late 1970s and early 1980s, bringing a theatrical wit to a comic book villain that helped define how the character would be portrayed for decades afterward. Hackman was also known throughout Hollywood as a notoriously demanding scene partner, someone who expected total commitment from everyone around him and had little patience for actors who came to set underprepared. Several directors who worked with him described him as intense but fair, a perfectionist whose gruffness on set almost always translated into performances of remarkable precision on screen, a quiet retirement, and a devastating end. Hackman largely retired from acting after 2004, following the release of Welcome to Mooseport, choosing to step away from Hollywood entirely rather than continue working into old age the way many of his peers did. He moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico with his second wife, classical pianist Betsy Arakawa, and lived a famously private life, rarely giving interviews and almost never appearing at public events tied to his old films. In February 2025, Hackman and Arakawa were found dead at their Santa Fe home, along with one of their dogs. Investigators later determined that Arakawa had died roughly a week earlier from hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare illness contracted through exposure to rodent droppings. Hackman, who was living with advanced Alzheimer's disease at the time, is believed to have died several days after his wife, with heart disease listed as a contributing factor to his death. He was 95 years old. The news stunned the film industry. Tributes poured in from actors and directors across generations, many of them citing The French Connection and Unforgiven as some of the finest performances in American film history. Dustin Hoffman, his friend of nearly 70 years, spoke publicly about the loss of a man he had shared some of his hardest and most formative years with, long before either of them had any idea what their careers would become. Clint Eastwood, who had directed him to his second Academy Award more than 3 decades earlier, also paid tribute, reflecting on Hackman's fierce professionalism and his refusal to ever phone in a performance, even in the smaller supporting roles he took later in his career. Warren Beatty, the man who had fought to cast him in Bonnie and Clyde nearly 60 years before Hackman's death, spoke of him as one of the most fearless actors of his generation, someone willing to make his characters as unlikable as the story required, without ever reaching for the audience's sympathy. Investigators noted that Hackman's advanced Alzheimer's disease likely meant he was unaware his wife had died, possibly for several days before he himself succumbed. The detail added a particular sadness to a story that had already stunned the public, a reminder of just how quietly and how privately Hackman had chosen to live out his final years, far from the fame and recognition that had defined the middle decades of his life. From a boy watching his father's car disappear down a street in Illinois, to a Marine, to the actor voted least likely to succeed by his own classmates, Gene Hackman built a career defined by the people who believed in him when almost no one else did, and by the performances that would outlast him by generations. Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. And before you leave, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.